Hi, welcome to Mytality, a podcast about persevering through adversity. While it's difficult to get an exact number, it's estimated that about 2 million people are looking to adopt a child in the United States. And some of those people are looking to adopt a hard-to-place child. And those are children who have emotional and physical challenges that make it just a little bit more difficult to adopt. But I have one of those guests with me today, a father, Jan Vest. He and his wife, Jane, live in Diamondhead, Mississippi, and they adopted their son, Scott, while they lived in Colorado. Scott there was diagnosed with attachment disorder and based upon physical and emotional issues that he had as a baby. And right now, though, Scott is an adult, and he now has a child of his own. So it's interesting that we're going to have a full perspective of what it was like from adoption to childhood, and now that Jan is even a grandfather. And it is a story that's not only inspirational, but it also is a story of true persevering through adversity. Welcome to the show, Jan. Really appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
Now, I don't want to know how old you are, because I'm pretty sure that you are still young enough to cause mischief, but old enough to know better. But how old is Scott now?
Scott's 31 years old. 31. Just turned 31 May 4th.
And his son, Liam, is
Liam.
And he is?
4.
He's 4 years old now. Well, that's wonderful.
Right,
That is great. Well, how did you get to know Scott and come about that Scott was available for adoption some 30 years ago? Because I know this was a long time.
Right. Well, Jane and I had been married about 2 or 3 years, and I had not had children. And she has 2 wonderful daughters that I call them my daughters now,
Right. Sure.
from previous marriage. And so we decided that we could adopt. We were still young enough. We were 39 years old, and we thought we were young enough to still have a small child. So Jane is a social worker and had worked in social work all her life, so she was very familiar with the adoption process. So we started looking for available children.
Mm-hmm.
We found Scott in Durango, Colorado, in La Plata County Department of Social Services. And then we started the process of getting to meet Scott and qualifying as parents, because it was a competitive process. And Scott was meeting, I think there were 4 sets of parents who were in the competition to be able to be selected.
Well, were you looking for a hard-to-place child, or were you just looking to
We
adopt?
were looking for a child, a young child,
okay.
Younger than 2 years old, and it was at that time it was 1994,
Okay.
or 93, it was much more difficult to adopt newborns or younger children. And so Jane had experience as a social worker professionally as being part of an adoption. She had adopted her first daughter herself as a newborn on the day that she was born. So that's why we started the process and started going over to Durango, Colorado, which was about 2.5 hours away from where we lived.
Okay.
And interviewing with the social workers and getting to meet Scott one day, and then it was just a wonderful process, really, and nerve-wracking at the same time, because we knew we were in competition.
Absolutely. So he was what? How old was he?
He was, when we first met him, he was about 13 months old.
Okay.
And then that adoption consideration process lasted for about 5 months. But they wanted to place Scott before he turned 2 years old, which is very important psychologically for his emotional well-being. So that's why it took that long.
And forgive me, because I do not know much about the adoption process. So how much do they tell you ahead of time? I mean, I know they're interested in you and interviewing you, but how much are you also able to interview to find out about the family that Scott is coming from and about Scott himself?
Right. Oh, that was very extensive, that whole process, because Scott was unfortunately severely abused by his father.
And you knew that at the time you were interviewing?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
Yes, we knew that. And Scott at 8 weeks old, Scott had 19 broken bones. including a fractured skull. And so he had been through an enormous amount and survived.
Sure.
His mom, both the parents were 16 years old, had faced their own struggles, themselves in their childhoods, and kind of into that repetitive cycle of abuse, really.
Yes.
And so we knew all of that, and we started that process of meeting with the social worker and all of the social workers that had really saved Scott's life, because they went in, and thank goodness for his mother, his biological mother, because she knew, she didn't know everything that was going on, but she knew that Scott was being hurt, and she took him to the emergency room, and that's where the social services got involved and took Scott out of their home. And then the criminal procedures of abuse against the father started. And so she was saved him. She saved him, and they tried to keep Scott with her.
Okay.
But she was just too immature at the time, and
she realized it.
She
didn't.
fought. She fought to keep Scott, which I admire her for. But they had tried a therapeutic care situation where she lived with in a foster home as the mother with Scott. But she was just not able to provide adequate care as the biological mother. And so that's why the social services decided to place Scott in protective custody and then finally into for adoption. But I will say, just to come to an end of that story with her, we stayed in contact with her, and that really was due to Jane's experience of knowing how important that was for the child, and knowing her birth mother and knowing his story. And she's a remarkable woman, I'm glad to say. It's emotional.
Right. No, absolutely. I can only imagine.
And but she it's really good because we're older parents.
Right.
She's not even 50 now. And so and he has a good relationship with her. She goes and visits. Liam, our grandson, is her grandson. And we share all of that together.
Oh, that is heartwarming. When did you all then realize, though, that because of the abuse that Scott had suffered, that he was having some problems from?
Well, we knew early on.
Oh, even at that point.
Oh,
in
yeah.
time.
I mean, they did a really good job of explaining to us that the chances of Scott having emotional and behavioral problems was greatly enhanced because of the abuse, and also that he had been in 3 foster homes before he was 14 months old. So that's where the attachment disorder really comes from, that he, number one, his main caregiver was the abuser, and then the instability of his life at such a young age caused that lack of ability to attach, and all of the other behaviors that go along with that. And he did have some minor neurological damage, but
that was caused physically.
That was caused physically, and we had, in some of the testing that was done, it basically indicated that he was going to have trouble with being able to solve some what you and I would call administrative problems. Right. Like dealing with the frustration of standing in line at the Department of Motor Services to get your driver's license. Doing simple things that for him, because he had been abused and physically hurt before he was verbal,
right,
that he has anger issues, and he doesn't know why. But that memory of that severe abuse, and again, in 19 broken bones, he had broken all of the digits on his hands. I mean, he'd been tortured, basically.
No, absolutely.
And so he started exhibiting problems probably when he got to preschool and and then in third grade. He really had trouble with touching paper, and that was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. It was difficult for him to do his homework.
Sure.
Because the anxiety that was created by him having to touch things that to him caused him pain.
Sure.
And without any rational explanation. And so it was that, but we made it through all of that challenge because of my wonderful wife, Jane.
Right,
You know,
sure.
I mean, I really,
Well, and just knowing you here, I mean, you were a big part of it too, obviously. But one of the things I wanted to say is just an observation as before we get to knowing a little bit more about attachment disorder and how it affects everything that was what Scott was going through. I just wanted to say that I'm not quite sure I have understood how early things that happen to a child or to a human in their life can affect them because, obviously Scott was very young, didn't know what was going on, but yet it was affecting him and will affect him for the rest of his life.
Right.
And we, even as adults, sometimes don't even think about what we do can have a profound effect on a child throughout their entire lives and things. And Scott is a big example of that.
Oh, right. And for me, that insight that you just described, it hit me right in the head too, because we have such limited ability as individuals to understand what makes us up individually.
Right.
And we don't understand people's behaviors that seem so strange, and why would they do these things that are irrational when they've come from an environment of toxic stress.
Yes.
Where they didn't have comfort at home and love and attention at home in the way that if you're fortunate, you had.
Right.
And so those people are the people who are in prison.
Yes.
Those are the people who are serious drug addicts and alcoholics
or dead.
Or dead. And it's that toxic trauma that fills the prisons, fills the county jails. And
it's a cycle.
It's a cycle. The people that live in poverty, why can't they make the right choices? Right. Why can't they do what's right? It kind of blows up this idea that, well, I'm successful because I worked through it. Well, if you had one hand tied behind your back and were beat up every day of your life before you were 3 years old, you would have an understanding, what it's like to walk in somebody else's shoes.
Correct.
I mean, it's not the same world for those children who have had to deal with that toxic stress from an early age. I mean, it's no wonder they can't read.
Absolutely.
It's no wonder they can't do math.
So this attachment disorder comes very, very early, but does it grow? Explain a little bit more about attachment disorder, because I don't want to assume that I know that I.
Right, and again, I'm not a psychiatrist, an expert, or whatever. I mean, I know more perhaps because of Jane and because of our experience.
You're right.
But it mainly is diagnosed when children appear not to be able to attach to their primary caregiver.
Okay.
And so you'll see them. One of the symptoms for Scott is when his mother picked him up. And you know how children, when they're little babies, will look so lovingly and close and dearly at their mother. Well, Scott didn't look at her.
Okay.
Scott, and he's 14 months old. And he was hyperactive even at that age because of this anxiety that he was feeling all the time, even though he was in a safe environment. When he had to deal with a problem And we all remember as children, losing our temper for the first time and kind of rehearsing out how we're going to solve emotional problems or dealing with our older brothers or younger siblings or whatever. Scott, was impaired in being able to use his senses and developmental processes to deal with those regular problems. And so you would look at Scott, and if you see the pictures of him, he was an adorable child. When we got a picture, he was like every other child you'd ever see. But when he was developing, he faced greater challenges. And he, for instance, again, I mentioned earlier about the obsessive compulsive disorder, where he couldn't touch paper. Well, he would wear long shirts. He would poke holes through the shirts at the bottom so his hand didn't have to touch the paper. So he could hold the pencil. And he did all that without saying anything to Jane or I. And a teacher, third grade teacher, in a parent-teacher conference, talked to us about it and said what was going on. And then we'd already had him in therapy, for a long time, per the social workers in La Plata County, where we adopted him. But it impaired his ability to learn.
Sure.
And so they gave a little simple test would take him probably 40 minutes longer because he had to deal with all these anxieties that he had because of that prior abuse.
Right.
And so you can imagine how that made him feel when his intelligence was fine.
Sure.
But he couldn't use his intelligence because he had this anxiety disorder that was attached to that trauma that he had. And so at one point, we took him he had a hard time transitioning from sixth grade, which was elementary school, into middle school.
Oh, big change.
So we took him out of school, out of the public school, and put him in a special school for a year where there were only 3 children per teacher. And when he would start having anxiety in that school, they would say, Scott, go out in the hallway, go relax, go to the gym, right? And so their whole approach to teaching was giving him different strategies, learning different strategies to deal with an internal anxiety that he had, which if you don't have these problems, you do that naturally because your psychology is more developed. And so he, attachment disorder is, and you can see it. I mean, you can see it in yourself. It's much like, going through that pain of being an adolescent and not getting selected to something that you really wanted, and you have that loss.
Right.
But just magnify that by 1,000,000 times when your primary caregiver has physically abused you.
Well, one of the things I think I probably know from basically what you have just said, but you haven't touched on it very much. I assume then this attachment disorder even transitioned to you and Jane in taking care of. So if he wasn't able to attach to his biological mother, did it make it much more difficult for him to attach to you as his new parents? And then what kind of challenges did you have as a parent trying to raise a child like this?
I think that we were very fortunate that Jane had her training as a social worker and had worked for the Department of Children and Family Services in the state of Illinois. She had worked in a group home with people with severe disabilities. She had great insight into dealing with those different populations. And so for me, it made it a lot easier because I got educated by Jane.
Sure. And
then the strategies that she used, I was able to execute, under her direction.
Right.
So I think the hardest thing, the biggest thing I remember was doing homework. And when he was in 3rd or 4th grade, and him getting so frustrated that he would be in tears and throwing books on the floor and throwing temper tantrums and those things when he was in third and fourth grade, and not really understanding, except our knowledge of what he had gone through and what Jane had told me about obsessive compulsive disorder. It's one thing to say the word obsessive compulsive disorder. It's another thing to actually understand internally what it means to the person who experiences it. And so Jane, because she had worked with those broad populations, knew and had experience therapeutically with that and how to develop strategies of communication. And those were the hardest things for me when he was little. The older he got, Scott, we were very fortunate, and I'm so proud of Scott. I mean, he knew his whole life. You know, the Department of Family Services had put together a life book for him, explaining what had happened to him and about his mother, his grandparents, and that his father had abused him. All of that was in his life because he has a life book. He has it today. He has that life book. And he wrote a book in sixth grade about what happened to him and that bad man who did this to me. And so his whole life early on was really therapeutic,
right?
You know, and he is a wonderful young man. I mean, he's like all of us who, you know, face the challenges of life, but I'm very, very proud of him.
Yeah, but it says an awful lot also of you and Jane, because I just know as a parent, I had a son who was had a learning disability himself, and the first thing when he gets frustrated is it's human nature for us to become frustrated too.
Right.
And sometimes we didn't approach our son in the most constructive way because number one, we didn't have the training to know what to do with it. Right. And number two, we didn't stop to think, okay, Mathen's going through our son is going through a particular issue. You know, just stop and take a breather here and go on and stuff. Right. So I have to say, it speaks a lot of you and Jane to understand and to know, and for Jane to have those skills to be able to say, hey, you know what, we need to take a step back and understand what he's going through. Yeah. And
the greatest success to us is that he's really a wonderful parent, right? A wonderful father, right? And he, it's a miracle.
And I want to ask about him as a father, because I'm sure he thinks about it constantly about and second guesses himself as a father. Right. And am I doing the right thing, or know, when his son needs discipline, because we all need discipline to do it correctly, and so that there isn't those emotional scars.
Yeah, he does worry about that, and but he almost 3 or 4 times a week he's on the phone, and
with y'all.
Yeah, and he has his son. They split kind of custody. Okay. So he has him 4 days a week, and she'll have him 3. Then they reverse that back and forth, and so he's there with him a lot. And but his biggest challenges now really have to do with that anger inside of him.
Oh, sure.
And it's but each year he gets better, a little better.
How does he deal with it?
I think he, this is his father talking, but I think he probably before he had Liam, he partied too much. He was a single guy in a beautiful part of the country, and he's a good-looking young man, and so he just partied too much. I'd say that's the best way to say it. And he, but he, going to work, having his job. All of that, I think, gives him a sense of higher self-esteem. He knows that he knows the issues that he has, and he tries to mitigate that those stressors that are caused by it. I mean, we have to help him still, because he again, the problem-solving issue, the administrative control of what things that we are so used to doing, are a little bit more difficult for him. And in other areas, he doesn't have any problem at all. But there's just certain areas where his anger overcomes him, and so he shuts down. He shuts down. That's what he does. And that's, it's, again, when you're, it's one thing if you're in a car wreck and you become quadriplegic and you can't walk. Right. It's another thing when the injury you have is neurological and psychological, and people can't see it.
Right.
And they don't understand it because they can't see it because of our own limitations.
Correct.
As human beings. And I think the school that I mentioned earlier that he went to, he did great in that school, and it helped him a whole lot, actually, when he got back into regular public school, because he wanted to go back to public school so badly. He didn't want to be a special ed kid, that was important to him. And it helped him. I mean, I think I've told you, he was accepted to 3 colleges. He decided to go back to Colorado, Durango, where he was born, and he went to Fort Lewis College for 2 years.
Okay.
He could have finished, but he just decided it wasn't for him. College was not for him.
Let me ask you something. Was he raised in Colorado, or did he spend much of his childhood in Illinois near the St. Louis area?
Yeah, he grew up. Yeah, we moved from Colorado the year that we adopted him back to Illinois.
Okay.
So most of his young life was spent in Illinois.
And that adjustment, I mean, how does he adjust? And was he able to make that adjustment fairly well?
Oh, yeah.
And then when he moved back, he adjusts. So those kind of things didn't seem to bother.
That was not a problem for him, because he was so relatively new in our family, and he was still an infant. And when we came back to Illinois, he did really, really well. Excellent. I mean, again, he just gave us so much joy.
Well, one of the reasons why I asked is because, to so many people, even to me, and to animals and such, a sense of place is what they attach to, or they don't attach to, or they don't want to go back to.
Right.
And that's why I was wondering if just this moving to Illinois or moving back to Colorado either bothered him or gave him a sense of security. Or
I think
it didn't matter, though.
I think that where he really was attached to Edwardsville, Illinois, where we lived for 25 years. He loved the school district. Is a wonderful school district. He got a great education. He knows he did. His verbal skills are excellent. He was an English major in college. He was really attached to that. Colorado for him was, I think, he works now in the cannabis industry, and he was a grower. He learned all kinds of scientific stuff and got certificates to do that. That was all kind of his his rebellion, that he was part of that generation in Colorado.
It isn't so much the challenges that he had that defines him now as a young man that he is of 31 years of age, but it is how he persevered and the love that you and your wife Jane gave to him, and your whole family, I think, gave to him to help him survive and get to this point. Right. I think that's one of the real part of the story that defines Scott today. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Oh no, I think that's 99.9% of it is that both Jane and I come from very loving families. They're not perfect families, but they're loving. Love was at the center of both of them. Our daughters, when we first adopted Scott was 18 months old when we formally adopted him. Our daughters were 13 and 11 years older, so they were. They were young women, and just Scott was such a beautiful child, and they were just in wonder of this little infant again, and all throughout his life now they have continued to be supportive. And just like any siblings, they have fights and they fall out with each other and they apologize and do all of those things. But I think the main superpower that Scott has is that superpower of love that comes from your own life experience and from your own religious beliefs and using love and forgiveness to help you deal with the challenges of life and be supportive of your family and those around you in the community so that you can build a society that can deal and survive with anything happening, right? And so that's been our experience. Scott, what's really funny, and I know everyone who has children sees this in them, is that you see both you and your spouse in the children and how they interact with the world and problem solve, and they really are a mutation of both of your consciousness. And what's amazing to me is that, and I take this as a religious thing too, is that Scott is not my biological son, or Jane's biological son, but there is no doubt he is our son.
Right.
And that little piece of us that transfers through consciousness and behavior and modeling of behavior will go on into his son and will go on into the future. So it's like, I kind of relate to it as a transmission of your soul, right? Or if, or that little kingdom of God, peace of God and love in you, you can give to other people. And that we've been able to experience that with our son.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. But I did want to leave you with one thought, and that is my favorite quote. And I've said it before, but my favorite quote is by Joe Louis. And he said, "You only live once, but if you do it right, once is enough." And that's what we want for you. So stay well, everyone, and God bless.